Welcome to everybody that's joined us here this morning. We're really excited for this event. Thank you to Haneen for that introduction. As we go along, please do post anything in the Q&A if you've got a question, or you can ask it, as she said, in person as later on. So I'm just going to introduce myself. I'm Lucina Hackman. I'm a professor of forensic anthropology. I'm based in the University of Dundee, and I co-edited this supplement, forensic anthropology supplement for the JRI with Professor Dame Sue Black, who's also here this morning. And we're really excited about this project. So we're going to talk to you just a little bit. I'm going to take you through briefly what the project was about, what we did when we looked at this supplement, and then I'm going to introduce each of the authors that we have on the call today, and they'll talk a little bit about each of their papers and just go through them. And as I say, we'll take questions at the end. So we'll go and have the presentations by them first and then do the Q&A after that. As I said, this was an exciting project for us. We established the certification system within the RAI. We've got that, we've got it up and running, but we believe that we need to keep going forwards as a discipline and as a group. And this was one of the chances to do that. We have our roots in anatomy as forensic anthropologists. We have our roots in biological anthropology, and we stand on the shoulders of those that have come before us. They've agreed to use, they've been brave enough, I suppose, sometimes to agree to use their skills when called upon by investigators. Whether we're talking about Wyman in 1849, who agreed to look at some recovered body parts to try and identify whether it was a victim and a missing person that the police had, or whether it was the anatomists in Edinburgh in 1935 who were asked to examine the bodies of Isabel Ruxton and Mary Jane Rogerston, both victims of Ruxton. All of these have come before us. And we have also forensic anthropologists, more recently, who have led the way in the identification and repatriation of those who've fallen victim to mass disasters or victim to suspected war crimes or proven war crimes. Many still work in these fields and are still identifying the disappeared so that they can return them to their families who are still missing them. We will hear more today from authors whose papers reflect the work that occurs in these spaces, and that's really exciting for us to have that occur. Of course, in order to do our work, we need a strong research base. And again, we follow a strong tradition in this area. Our authors in this supplement will present not only traditional research in forensic anthropology, but also new methods, a new method for undertaking literature reviews, and also new ways in which we can apply our knowledge and our work to forensic investigations. And again, this is all part of us coming together and to take the discipline forwards. As noted, we are justifiably proud of our certification process that the RAI supports and has supported throughout. And recently reviewed this and began to expand, firstly, to allow non-UK forensic anthropology practitioners to apply for certification, but also to include practitioners from social anthropology sphere who also give evidence in courts. After all, forensic simply comes from the Latin word forensis, which means of the forum before the law courts of ancient Rome. And therefore, we come together as people that take our skill set and use that in civil and criminal investigations. And we believe, in the RAI believes, that we should spread this umbrella to any anthropologist who does so, whether they come from social, whether they come from the traditional forensic anthropology sphere. As a result, this edition, this supplement, is representative of our belief and understanding that we are more influential, stronger, and we will continue to move forwards if we recognise how we can work across specialisms and how we can bring those specialisms in together. Now, we were editors of this supplement, and it is our authors who I have to thank for writing and producing their papers that allow this to be such a strong production. And I'm going to not continue to talk for any longer. I'm going to just move to introducing those authors. I'm going to start by introducing Dr. James Rose, who's going to speak about his paper, Forensic Social Anthropology, an Australian Perspective. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lucina, and thank you, everyone, at the Institute and around the world for having me here today. I'd like to say a special thank you to Lucina and Prof. Dame Sue Black and David Shanklin, Director of the RAI, who aren't here, for their inspiring conversations back in 2021, which led to my involvement in this project, not just the special issue, but in fact the elaboration of the regulatory framework that the RAI maintains for practicing forensic physical or biological anthropologists, to those of us in social anthropology who also, as Lucina says, work in courtroom settings in the provision of expert evidence. I do feel like a black sheep in this setting, possibly as the only non-science person, non-hard science person in the room. But as Lucina also says, it's a wonderful opportunity, and this is reflected in my contribution to the journal, to revisit some of the threads that we do share in common, not just as practitioners of fields within a common discipline, but as those of us who understand a common cause towards access to justice for those who may not have had a chance to benefit from justice during their lives. So what I'd like to talk about very briefly in the short time that I have is my introduction professionally to the provision of expert evidence in courtroom settings, which comes from my work with Indigenous Australian communities in Australia, who over the past 200 odd years have found themselves exposed to different phases of the British colonial experiment that is older than just the engagement with Australia, but affects an unfortunately large number of countries around the world. It wasn't until the late 1960s that Indigenous Australians were first granted an opportunity before any court in Australia to have their claims to land in Australia heard in a formal way. And right from the outset, at that time, in a precedent-setting matter that was heard in the Northern Territory of Australia, which is a particular secondary tier jurisdiction within the Commonwealth of Australia, drew upon the expertise of social anthropologists who had been working for decades with not just communities in the area where the claim was being heard in what we call Arnhem Land, which is up near Papua New Guinea on the Torres Strait, but with communities all over Australia who had experienced similar effects of disposition and marginalisation by various governments in Australia. The role of social anthropologists in that matter, which was called Milirrupum, after the name of the lead claimant, versus Nabalco, which was a bauxite mining company, had to do with demonstrating that there was a system of what we call, a little bit anachronistically, laws and customs maintained by that community of people in Arnhem Land, which gave rise to a range of real-world practices, economic, religious, linguistic, and other forms of practices that could be formally modelled and demonstrated to the judge hearing the matter as equivalent to laws and customs observed by members or citizens of the British Commonwealth at that time. And in a precedent-setting decision, Justice Blackburn rejected the claim by the respondents that the social anthropological evidence being heard was hearsay, and that in fact it should be admissible in the same way that medical evidence is admissible, based not only on medical hypotheses about the functioning of the human body, but about verbal advice from a patient to a doctor about their own experiences of their symptoms. So revolutionary was this decision that it set the stage for social anthropologist involvement in Australian courts for the next 50 years. So I am what I would describe as the fourth generation heir to that precedent-setting case. Now, the land claim that was made at the time was not successful, but thanks to a government recognition that without legislative intervention, Australia might find itself in a constitutional crisis, equivalent to what was happening in countries such as South Africa at the time. It opened up a whole new way for the executive and judicial branches of government in Australia to consider the rights of Indigenous people, but most importantly, for people in our sector, opened up an entire new field of research and expertise. And I'm not sure how I'm getting on with my minutes, Lucina, but I do encourage people to have a closer look at that article to get a sense of the way that forensic specialization develops in fields like social anthropology, not by alienating it from its sister fields, but in fact drawing them together into a more unified and integrated approach to thinking about problems like access to justice and equity before the law. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for that, James. It's really interesting and it's really exciting times at the moment in these areas. I'm going to move on to our next speaker, who's Professor Lucy Easthope, who's going to talk about her paper, Forensic Uncertainty, Fragile Remains in DNA as a Panacea, an ethnographic observation of the challenges in 21st century disaster victim identification. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Lucina. And thank you also, I think, for creating such a safe and supportive place to submit an article. I very much enjoy problematizing these issues, but I find academic writing can be a really unsafe place, and this has been a really supportive process to publication. So I really wanted to call that and thank you for that. And also just so pleased that this will exist, because I think people who followed some of my work over the recent years will know that these concepts that I'm raising are very difficult. They're very, very nuanced and quite straining, and it was quite difficult to get them written up. And then finally there's this piece out there, so I'm really thrilled about it. I too slightly break the mold. I've been accused of that before. I'm a very proud emergency planner with a sort of slightly circuitous academic discipline and background. So I have degrees in law and then disaster management, and then my PhD is awarded at the School of Medicine in Lancaster University for looking at the way that emergency planning tools and technologies are used. And that really brought me into looking specifically at the very minute observations of a process called disaster victim identification. And one of the things I think about me was that by being an emergency planner who is very interested in what happens after the emergency, I had been very generously let into the space and the sphere of identification practices, but really without any of the legitimate groundings in some way of the biological and forensic anthropologists. So they, I think, welcomed me in, but also knew that I was constantly on a kind of learning transmission. I was there to learn. But what was useful was my insights into how the process would then interact with things like families and societies and the community. So disaster victim identification with 3 capital letters, D, V, and I, and that was something I argued with in the typesetting of the final article. It was very important to me that the capital letters stayed in, because this becomes a frame and a phrasing for our work. DVI is a technical and scientific process, but interacts with also us at the most human and basic and spiritual and forensic and practical. It is the identification of sometimes very, very small and very damaged remains that our ability has grown to create from things like socio-technical disasters and all sorts of harms wrought by man around the world. So we end up with this science just continually evolving. And one of the things that fascinated me about this was the claims made in these spaces by often proceduralists and strategists, never the scientists. The scientists were, as you would expect the best scientists to be in the physical sciences, nuanced and careful about the claims, but some very big claims being made in the spaces about the technologies. And my practical work as an emergency planner would often bring me into these spaces, but as we all know, as scholars, you also need to be able to frame this ethically and in a research space. And in 2013, an opportunity arose to receive an urgency grant from the ESRC in disaster management and head out to a place called Lac-Megantic, which had just suffered a very tragic fire with very, very high temperatures and 47 deceased. And by getting out there quite quickly, but also with quite a clear mandate, being able to observe ethnographically. And ethnography in itself is a very important part of anthropological studies. It's very, very, very up close practice that watches how the pen is used, how the deviations happen. When one of the things that I study in the paper is some very high-tech technology, rapid DNA machines transported with great ceremony to the site, and then watching somebody unplug them at the wall to charge their laptop. So watching how humans interact with some of the most expensive and most highly developed technologies in the world. Also, the ambivalence we see around these technologies may be great for DVI, but you're also aware that the reason there's a high budget for them is because they're also great for things like migration testing at the border and separating families who may have some kind of dispute about their kinship that the authorities can use to send back children to another place. So lots of ambivalences, lots of challenges. I'm in British emergency planning, what is sometimes not fondly known as the wild card. I like to be used on exercises and reviews to raise challenges about these technologies, one of which was in the American use of the technology, there had been no real consideration in the protocols about when you're using DNA in the DVI environment, what if the family situation is difficult? So something like an adoption or, as I say, a kind of revised kinship situation where there's no biological link, but the strength of relationship is social and human. So the paper takes you through my musings, I think, my problematization of the issue. I hope, and I've had some good feedback on early preprints, I hope nobody's thinking that I'm coming down on one particular position or another. I'm raising issues. The other thing about being somewhere in the middle of all of this, rather than being on one camp or another, is that I can see that if you are, for example, in a forensic setting trying to come up with a strategy, there are some really big questions as we go into identification sciences in the next few years. Questions about how far do we go with DNA testing? How far do the promises reach? And how much do we spend? I think recent disasters like the pandemic have really shed a light on things like the commercialization of hope. So the idea of selling DNA testing, but at millions and millions of pounds or dollars, and the idea of the resting remains. So that was something that I stay in the middle on. I raise as issues as academic critique allows you to do, but I hope that I've raised some interesting challenges. The other thing, and I'm so grateful to all, I am a very proud member of the JRAI, and I get their publications all of the time. And one of the things that I think reading that constantly has helped me to do is the nuance needed when you are talking about some very, very, very delicate concepts. And I really salute that the publication as a whole for allowing us to do that, because I think that's one of the most difficult challenges that I notice the forensic scientists often have, is communicating some of these really, really difficult, complex issues. And I'm very grateful actually to my proofreaders and my editors, one of whom was my mum, who read it for two things. One was for sense making, which I'm not always known for. And the other was a sort of a dignity and decency, because sometimes in the forensic science world, you're explaining concepts and maybe you're raising some pretty dark nightmares in people's heads. So that was a really interesting challenge about putting my science out there. And again, just a huge thank you for allowing me to do that. I hope people come back to me with lots of questions on it.
Thank you so much, Lucy. And I'm sure they will. I'm sure there'll be loads of questions for you. I'm going to move to our next speaker. That's Valentina Panchis. She's going to discuss her paper, Forensic Age Estimation of Living Individuals, a novel bibliometric approach to the literature review. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Lucina. So as Lucina was saying, today I will be presenting the paper that I wrote on the investigation of the literature of forensic age estimation in the living using a bibliometric approach. So bibliometric analysis is a method used to explore and analyze extensive data within the literature. And it is an important tool for the identification of patterns, trends and potential research gaps within the topic. In the past, only few papers were published regarding a bibliometric approach to the literature review in forensic anthropology, but there were none that investigated the topic of forensic age estimation in the living. In terms of methodology, we conducted our research using the online database Scopus that was compatible with the open source script that was available, to ensure that even the earliest publications were included in the study. No year range was selected, although this study was conducted in 2020, so all the papers included are up to the year 2019. And the publications that are included in the study were only focused on the assessment of age up to 21 years threshold. Among the analyses that we carried out, there was publication trends, authors affiliations, citation, open access publications, and keywords analysis. Furthermore, we also conducted an analysis to investigate the relation between imaging techniques and the dental or skeletal areas under examination. The final number of publications that was retrieved was of 644 papers, with the first paper that appeared in the list published in 1974 by Gustafsson and Koch on the development of methodology for dental age estimation. And it is very important to notice that the number of publications regarding age estimation in the living extremely increased during the years, as the number of authors contributing to the subject as well, with peaks in number of publications being recorded in 2014, 2016, 2018, and finally in 2019, with the highest number of publication of 87 articles. From the author's country affiliation analysis, it was important to notice that Europe was identified as the continent with the highest author's contribution, with 424 affiliations, of which Germany and Italy were at the top of the contributions. So these findings are actually coherent with the patterns and statistics of migration, as European countries have witnessed significant numbers of asylum applications over the years. For example, last year, European countries received almost 1 million applications, with Germany receiving a quarter of these applications. And also last year, the application from unaccompanied children were 222,000. So it's a lot of people migrating to Europe. So the findings of the study highlight the dominance of European affiliations in the research related to age estimation in the living. The analysis of author and index keywords was also carried out to identify any differences between keywords chosen by the authors themselves and the keywords that were directly generated by Scopus. Among the authors' keywords, the most common was age estimation, that was also followed by dental age estimation and forensic odontology. On the other hand, the most common index keywords were more generic. So we had keywords like human and humans, followed by male, female, and adolescent. So these findings highlight the differences that can be noticed between keywords chosen by the authors themselves that are specific and topic-oriented, and the index keywords automatically generated that are more generic. Therefore, there is the need for precise and context-specific keywords, especially for index keywords, to improve the discoverability of the research as well. So from the list generated from Scopus, it was also decided to investigate the correlation between the choice of imaging technique and the either the dental or the skeletal area under examination. So among the 644 studies, 612 studies only used one imaging technique, but it was important to notice that 32 studies used 2 or more imaging techniques combined to also evaluate the differences that they could see in the development using more than one imaging technique. Whilst studies using skeletal and dental radiography were constant throughout the years of publication included in the study, for example, for CT scan, ultrasound, and MRI was not the same. So it was noticed an increase in number of publications in 2010 for CT scan, in 2013 for ultrasound, and between 2013 and 2014 for MRI. So especially for magnetic resonance imaging, the numbers of papers published using this imaging technique have increased, especially in Can you hear me? Okay, sorry. I thought I froze for a second. So as I was saying, especially for magnetic resonance imaging, the numbers of papers published using this imaging technique have increased, especially in 2019 with 14 papers recorded for that year. Nonetheless, the overall number of publications using CT scan, ultrasound, and MRI is still lower than the numbers of studies published using radiography. So for the 612 studies that used only one imaging technique, the correlation with the dental skeletal area was investigated more in detail. So dental age estimation and age estimation from the hand and wrist are still the most common areas investigated. The highest number of publication was recorded for the use of teeth in the age estimation with 399 studies, of which 387 were carried out using dental radiography. And the publication on the hand and wrist were a total of 80, with 62 studies carried out using radiography. The medial hand of the clavicle was also of interest, with the majority of the papers published using CT scan. More recently, it was noticed an increase in numbers of publication using MRI for dental age estimation and for the estimation from the medial end of the clavicle and the knee, and especially of the hand and wrist, with 17 papers published using MRI as imaging modality. So the investigation into the imaging techniques and their correlation with the dental and skeletal areas showed the developing nature of this research, with the increasing adoption as well of advanced imaging methods, like, for example, MRIs in recent years, which is also correlated to the demand of the use of non-ionizing modalities for age estimation purposes. So our bibliometric analysis of the literature in forensic age estimation in the living has provided insights into the evolution of this field throughout the years. We have observed a substantial growth in the publication over the years, with 2019 marking a peak in the research activity. And these trends reflect the increasing importance of the age estimation in various applications, such as the forensic investigations and the immigration processes as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Valentina. And I'm going to call on our last but by no means least author in this list, and then we will move to questions and answers. So I've got Professor Dame Sue Black, who's going to talk about forensic examination of the hands.
Good morning. Thank you very much indeed, and what a pleasure. Lucina and I tried to bring together the supplement as COVID kicked off. So it's been a long time coming, and I'm enormously grateful to everybody, especially the RAI, who've really been incredibly patient as we've tried to persuade people to help us out and to get this to publication level. I was a previous president of the Royal Anthropological Institute, and it's an incredibly important institution for the discipline of forensic anthropology, not just in the UK, but across the world. And I'm really delighted to have James here, because what it does say with James in the room is that forensic anthropology is not about bones. It is about the study of the human and how the human can then play its part, that study, in the courtroom. So it really is a delight to see such a range of papers coming into the supplement that kicks the trend of thinking that forensic anthropology is just about bone. It most certainly is not. It's about the human and the way in which the human presents in all sorts of ways, both physical and social. Not only was I president of the RAI, but I have actually been a forensic anthropologist for 40 years, beyond actually a point at which I don't think the term existed in the UK. So I now feel incredibly old. But I'd like to make Lucina feel equally old, because she has been my wingman and my partner in all of the forensic investigations I have done now for 23 years. So we have lasted longer than many marriages. And it is incredibly important, if you are a practicing forensic anthropologist, that you have a wingman. You have that person that you can bounce ideas off, that person who watches you. Because as Lucy has said to us, it can be an incredibly challenging environment. And we are no good in that environment if we are in any way negatively affected. So it's really important that what we have is the support mechanisms all the way through. If you're a forensic anthropologist, a budding anthropologist coming through, find yourself that wingman. You need to be there for them, because they will be there for you. The times will be challenging, and we really do need to look after each other. One of the interesting things about being a forensic anthropologist is that I think I'm an anatomist, first of all, and I often thought about the forensic as something that came a little bit later. And anatomy is incredibly important to the subject and the study of the subject. If we restrict what we do to understanding bone, then we restrict the full range of our knowledge. And so if we're going to look at the physical side of forensic anthropology, we need to understand the entirety of the human body. So that I am an anatomist, first of all, and then I apply that anatomy into the world of forensic science. The first case I did was in the first year of my PhD, and it was in fact 40 years ago. So that it shows that the discipline is still required, and it has evolved, but perhaps not evolved at a pace that many of us would like it to do so. There's no doubt that the thing that changed the course for the kind of work that we do was when Alec Jeffreys in the 1980s had that moment in his lab in Leicestershire where he was pulling his hair out. And Alec didn't have a lot of hair to pull out, but he was pulling his hair out because he couldn't get his medical genetics experiments to work. And he had that eureka moment where he realized the reason his experiments didn't work was because our DNA were all different. And those moments in the history of a subject do not come frequently. They are rare. They are step changes. And with the first case that came in the 1980s using DNA, it changed the requirements and the ask being made of forensic anthropologists. And Lucina quite rightly took us back to the Buck Ruxton case. That was one of the first cases where anatomy and the police investigation really came together. So we do stand on the shoulders of giants, but we do need to also step forward and step off those shoulders to find our own path. I thought it amazing the work that Valentina had talked about and the analysis that we have of the different forms in which our research appears and how we record it. And I do think that being able to look through our bibliographies in the way that she has suggested is a huge step forward, and something that I really do feel is a way for us to look at trends and to be able to pinpoint what it is that is coming next. Lucina and I had that moment, and though I don't think at the time we realized we had that moment, back in 2006, which was 17 years ago. And it came about because a photographer from the Metropolitan Police phoned us up. And often you find as a forensic anthropologist, you are the scrapings at the bottom of a barrel. And by that, I mean, they've done all the other tests they can think of, and they don't know who else to ask now. And so they think, we'll ask the anthropologists. And it was one of those cases. It was a young girl who alleged that her father came into her bedroom at night and sexually abused her. And she told her mother, and her mother did not believe her. The most incredibly brave teenage young woman who then placed her camera on her computer knowing that night she would be abused again, and she recorded what happened. And at 4:30 in the morning, what we saw was an arm, a forearm and a hand coming into view of the camera. And when you leave your camera and your computer on overnight, it clicks into infrared mode. And in infrared mode, it allows us to see the pattern of veins on the back of the hand. So all the police had was a picture of a hand and a forearm, no face. And they came to us and they said, can you identify who this person is? And the answer is easy. No, we can't. You know, it's simple as that, but that's how research starts. When somebody asks a question and you don't have the answer, that's the kernel of growth that's needed to allow an area of research to occur. So we looked at the images and we could see the superficial vein patterns. And we know as anatomists that the vein patterns distal to the level of the antecubital fossa in the forearm are variable. And we know that even Vesalius in the 1500s knew it. It's not new. But what it hadn't done was it hadn't been applied into the courtroom. And as always happens, you're rarely the person who has the new idea. Usually everybody else, or a good number of people before you, have had the idea. It's just that the planets haven't aligned. And when those planets do align, that there is a need, that there is an expertise, and that there is sufficient background information to be able to use them, suddenly you're in a different position. Now, we knew that a lot of the work that had been done on vein pattern recognition was in the field of biometrics. And Rice in particular had really kicked off that whole field in the 1980s about could you use the vein patterns in your fingers as a barcode? And the answer is yes, you can, because it's so variable. And we now are really quite content to put our finger into a reader and have our vein patterns checked. But when the case came through in 2006, what Lucina and I knew was that there was a need, because there was a question being asked. And the police were saying to us, this is not something that's going to go away. This is a huge problem. We need science to be able to help us. We knew that there was a strong anatomical background to what we were saying. We knew there was a strong literature in the biometrics research. Could we bring them together? And so we did a comparison on the vein patterns of the forearm and hand between the suspect, which was Dad, and the offender. And they matched. And you have to be very careful when you are involved in emerging science that you don't overstep the mark. We didn't know what we could say with any degree of certainty, but what we did know is we could say we cannot exclude the possibility of Dad being the offender. We couldn't tell you with what level of certainty he might be, and of course it would never be certainty, it would be probability, because the research simply hadn't been done. But the courts, surprisingly, are really quite welcoming of emerging science. And the Law Commission report says that very openly, as long as you don't overstep the mark. And that's why it is so important that forensic anthropologists are aware of the legal limitations to what they can say and what they can do. Because the courtroom is an alien place for a scientist. It's a gladiatorial arena, and it's somebody else's rules, it's not ours. But if we're going to put ourselves forward and risk our reputation, we have to understand those rules. So I went into court and I gave evidence, and all I simply could say was I could not exclude Dad. I couldn't say to any level of confidence whether it was Dad or not. The jury left the room and the jury came back and they found Dad not guilty. And I asked our barrister what we'd done wrong. That's the classic thing. You always blame yourself. And the barrister had said to me something that will stay with me for the rest of my days, is that she said, you didn't do anything wrong. There was nothing wrong with your evidence. They didn't believe the girl because she didn't break down and cry. Our justice system cannot be predicated on whether members of the public choose to believe a traumatized teenage girl because she had it so together to be able to stand up and give evidence in court against her father. He was found not guilty, and therefore presumably he was released back into the family home. I have no idea what has happened to that young girl, but we tell her story, and we tell her story repeatedly because we weren't able to help her on that day. But the work that we have done since has gone on to help hundreds of individuals in the same position as her. I don't know if she's still alive. If she is, our hope is that one day she will hear and recognize the story, and I will never tell anybody her name, so I will know if it is her. And I want her to know that science listened that day. Science went out and did the research, and it has made a change, and that's her legacy. It's not ours. We realized that what we needed was a database. And it just so happened in Dundee that we had about 500 police officers going through our department whilst we were training them in the very subject that Lucy was talking about, DVI. And we asked them, would they be prepared to strip to their underwear for us? Why not? To be able to photograph their hands, their arms, their forearms, their feet, their legs, and their thighs. We didn't go anywhere else. That was just too much for us. And it meant that we had a database, and a database that we could start to interrogate, that said, how frequently do we find these different patterns? And what became very clear over the years was that we weren't even touching the hair on the leg of a flea sitting on top of the iceberg that is the volume that the police have to deal with in terms of crimes of sexual abuse against children, and particularly in those that relate to images, whether they're photographic images or video images. So whilst our research went on, and we were very, I think I can safely say we were really reassured that we were on the right track, because we've now helped the police to secure over 30 full life sentences and over 500 years of prison sentencing for those that might not have been convicted otherwise. So we are convinced that we've made a difference, but not enough of a difference, because this is a global phenomenon. So we were very lucky that we were able to get some ERC funding before the UK left Europe. What a wonderful idea that was, wasn't it? But we got £2.5 million as a research project for the H Unique project, which is hands unique. And we're able now to train computers to do the sorts of work that Lucina and I were doing in the tracing of the anatomical features, whether it's in hands, forearms, arms, feet, legs, or thighs. And the computer now can find the vein patterns with greater reliability than either of us can. They can also find the knuckle skin crease patterns. They can extract the pigment patterns. And so what we've created through artificial intelligence is a multimodal biometric, something that can be used to search the Interpol databases to be able to say, does the hand of this offender appear in any of the millions, and I do mean millions of images that they hold in their databases. So we decided that we would like to publish some research and also some words on the protocols and procedures that we have followed in these cases over the years. There is nowhere else that we would have wanted to publish this except with the RAI, because the RAI has given us, as a discipline within the UK, the opportunity to professionalize, to be able to bring together groups of individuals to ensure that the work that we do is of a standard that meets the requirements of our courtroom. So it's a difficult topic for many to read. It is also one that most people don't think belongs within the realm of forensic anthropology, but it certainly does. And it's 17 years worth of research that is now heading into the field of AI. So my advice to anyone who is in an early career research position is, when you're asked a question, follow it, see where it takes you, because you never know, you might be one of those people who in a case was able to put somebody like Richard Huckle into prison for consecutive life sentences, one of the UK's most prolific paedophiles. And the research that was done on the basis of that young woman's case 17 years ago is what takes these predators out of the world and protects those who are vulnerable. Please don't ever think for a moment that forensic anthropology is somebody just playing with bones. It is something that affects lives, it affects policy, and it affects justice. And it is a great honor for me to be a part of that discipline, to have been a part of the RAI, to sit with my colleagues who have written these papers, but perhaps more than anything, to have a wingman who's lasted longer than most marriages. That says a lot. Thank you, Lucina.
Thank you very much, Sue. Thank you. I don't know, we have to follow that really and what to say. I'm going to introduce, we have one more speaker for you who's just arrived, and then we'll take questions. And please do come forward with your questions because I think everybody is quite happy to answer. We've got now Rose Drew, who is going to speak to us about her paper, which is The Loss of Identity in 19th Century Norway, Oslo's House of Correction. Thank you, Rose.
Thank you very much. Oh my God, I'm quite echoey. I'm in a bike shed. Sorry. Anyway, let me come out here a little bit. It's either I'm echoey or you can't see me. Thank you. Good morning. And thank you for this opportunity. Gwen and mine's article focuses on 300 or so individuals from a Norwegian workhouse that was in use from the 1750s to about the 1930s. Since January 2015, Gwen and I have been comprehensively analyzing human skeletal remains from the workhouse cemeteries associated with at least 3 burial removals. 1939, the biggest one in 1989, and one in between that we're not sure of when. I first assessed a collection in a very preliminary way, really an inventory, at Per Holk's request between 2009 and 10. So we know this assemblage pretty well, and we're delighted, really, to be included in this issue. We noted early on quite a few individuals have evidence consistent with tuberculosis, in some cases pathognomic lesions in the ribs and vertebrae. TB was quite often cited as a cause of death in archival documents as relayed by Per Holk. After a lot of effort, we were given permission to sample some of the remains. Researchers based in Vienna, under the direction of Irina Schulman, have attempted to isolate TB from the remains of about 65 individuals, and it has not worked. I can talk maybe about that a little bit later. However, the identification of biological sex was obtained from about half of these 65 people, so about 33, 9 of which had never been assigned to sex by Gwen or I because of incomplete remains, commingling, they were juveniles. And so of these 33, 22 agreed with our anthropological assessments, and 2 did not. A young female who we had decided might be male and wasn't, and a severely disabled young female who was actually male. And I feel okay with these results. I think that's not bad. So our link in to this issue is really via identity and the very real contributions physical anthropologists offer when recognizing standard traits such as age, cohort at death, probable sex, ancestral group, stature, and the individuating traits such as impairment, chronic illness that's affect the bones, atypical height, and so on. And human bone specialists also consider these characteristics in context. And so as we did, when on balance, we presume the neonate recovered in 1989 is almost certainly to be baby Anne. Jorunn Torstad, an Oslo-based genealogist, had traced her great-great-great-grandfather and his second wife, Berit, to the burial archives of Tugthuset, which is the name of the Oslo workhouse. And she found that they'd had a daughter called Anne. The father died in August 1808, about age, and Fed wrote to Per Holk in very late 2015 and asked if any of the graves had a spedborn, a newborn, and there is one. We have tried at least 3 times to convince the Norwegian Ethics Board to permit kinship analyses. I really understand the refusal for us to test both Petra's pyramids, which had been the first plan, with results that were not going to even be certain. Jorunn Torstad, the potential living relative, was early on presumed connected to only through the paternal line, thus the choice of Y chromosomal analysis requiring both of these dense inner bones. This plan had been advocated by our first biomolecular worker, who then became busy because the ethics application took about a year. They wanted more information, they wanted another letter, they wanted this, which is fine. Yet when we interrogated the lineage assumptions about Jorunn, other options, which by then had been suggested by Professor Cordula Haas in early 2019, fell apart. If the lineage had passed along males to Jorunn, success might have been possible if we'd had these bones and access to DNA from her father, even just a licked postage stamp. But alas, not only had her father left very few possessions, there is a female interruption to the lineage. The great-great-great-grandfather, father of Anne, had left his firstborn son, thankfully, at home with relatives. That son went on to have a daughter. The daughter had a son, the son had a son, and that's the father of Jorunn Torstad. Thus, we'd have needed, from my understanding, the whole genome SNP typing. It could be claimed baby Anne's human rights justify the bone wastage and the risk. It can just as easily be claimed existing contextual information supports that this neonate is baby Anne. There are only 2 neonates listed in the burial records for Tuktoyaktuk, a stillborn nameless boy and Anne. A simple sex determination would at least exclude 1. This request has also been denied. This test would take much less bone, and yet the ethics board feels the scientific value of what is almost a complete neonate is more important than assigning her a name, and only that if she's female. Being buried in a tiny coffin with wood shavings supports this being Anne. The infant outlived her mother by about a week. That would have given staff time to grow fond or at least recognize the obligation to provide a coffin and a proper burial equally. Conjecture here. The nameless boy might have worked his way into the jaded hearts of workhouse staff. If while an inmate, the mother became somehow beloved or a figure of sympathy, if the birth was abnormally prolonged or otherwise difficult, if the boy was in the right place at the right time to be deemed worthy of a coffin, all conjecture and yet not just so stories really. And to refer to Lucy Easthope's excellent discussion of the decisions made in, I'm going to mispronounce this, sorry, in Lac Magentic. Why subject this neonate skeleton to such intrusions? So then the larger point of our paper is the anonymity and apathy according to these impoverished problem people 200 years ago. In a culture that respected hard work and sober living and that blamed malnutrition on poor food choices, that blamed poverty, physical impairment, mental impairment, addiction, petty crimes, being pressured into sex or even sexuality, again, on personal choices. And yet 200 years on, how far away are we from that? Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Rose, and thank you for that. It's really interesting. So that's our speakers have all spoken now, and we are able to open up to any questions that you might have. If you don't mind posting your questions in the Q&A box, I'd be really grateful, and we can ask all of our speakers any questions you have. I see that somebody's put one in the chat. I'm actually going to just read that out. I've got here from a question. So Sue, fantastic inspiration for Monday morning. Going to get out their Grey's Anatomy book now. This is from Aine. She studied medicine at the University College Cork for years and now draws and paints skulls and other bones from the archaeological record, mostly Viking and Anglo-Saxon. And she's wondered often about publishing these paintings in the context of the field of law. Essentially, these paintings are portraits of actual individuals from specific genealogies, and I wondered if you had any advice about that.
I think you should speak to someone who's got a law degree, and that would be either Lucina or Lucy, is the truth. Certainly, the restrictions on anatomical drawings are different in different parts of the UK. So there's a different set of laws in Scotland than there are in England and Wales, for example. If the individuals are unidentified, then I don't believe there is a problem. If they are identified and living, or there are living relatives, then there may well be problems. But I'd be very happy for either Lucina or Lucy to kick in on that, because I suspect you have more knowledge of that than I do.
Thank you. I'm going to pass that on to Lucy.
So just to clarify, then these are drawings that that you would like to publish as part of a legal discussion, or what they would add to the field. The only thing, I mean, I feel free to contact me to discuss a bit more, because this would chime with work that we do on what we call kind of controversial archives, I think, and the ethical dilemmas that we see in exhibition. So it's not always just about the purity of making sure you've got all the consents. It's also sometimes the very nature and the context can reveal much more than you might realize. So I would tread carefully, but I would actually consider this fits with what we call contested archive. So please do take it up with me offline.
Thank you, Lucy. I've got a question here about so Imogen has asked, I'm interested in the division sometimes drawn between science and other. I've always thought that the vast majority of science is socially constructed and at best about subjective interpretation. How do the panel feel about this? I think that doing so opens the human that Sue identifies to as well. Does anybody like to take that up? James, do you want to start with that one?
Thanks, Lucina. Yes, that sounds like a question for a social anthropologist. Well, it's hard to tell exactly what Imogen is getting at because there are some nouns missing. I mean, the other what in the first instance, I suppose, is my question. But I can try and intuit an answer based on my training in social anthropology in the 90s, when there was a great debate raging about the relevance of fact and truth from a philosophical perspective. And there was a tremendous interest in Australia, and I think possibly also in the US, and I'm not sure to what extent in the UK, in certain French philosophers around whether there was such a thing as fact or truth. And of course, now 30 years later, here we are in a situation where that kind of argument almost overturned a democratic election in one of the world's most powerful democracies, quote unquote. So I'm not sure about the validity of what we were being taught at the University of Adelaide in the mid-90s in terms of the social construction of truth and facts. But my own personal opinion, having grown up in a remote Indigenous community in Central Australia, where I lost more friends than I care to recall to preventable diseases that you normally only see in third world countries, is what led me into social anthropology in the first instance. Because the barriers between their ability to survive in a first world country like Australia emerged almost entirely from a cultural problem. And it was that their culture, which had persisted in Australia for 60,000 years, almost entirely consistently, was not the culture of either the executive or judicial branches of the Commonwealth of Australia. And the problem for them is that the education policies and the health policies and the justice policies of the country that they happened to be born into did not recognize the idea systems, or what we might call the autochthonous cultural models, that had allowed them to survive in Australia for 60,000 years. And in the course of not understanding their culture, had cast them aside once their economic value to the Australian cattle industry and the Australian sheep industry had ceased, right? So from my perspective, and I say this with training in humanities and arts, and my first degree was in fact in fine arts. I trained as a painter originally, a landscape painter and a portrait painter, is that if we question the validity or the universality of core values like healthcare and the right to access justice or equality of justice, then we begin to question the right of people to even live. So I'm not sure that I actually am the best person to answer that question, Lucina, but there you go. That's my position. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. I'm actually going to ask Lucy to come in a little bit on that, because Lucy, you've been out there in different countries and seen where we have applied our science, that universality idea of science, to these in different cultures and in different well, the DVI situations, but in different cultures and societies, and see. So we're coming in with our ideas each time we've done it, and how you see that with that idea of universality of science.
And I think also, you know, the kind of, there's an imperialistic, colonialistic idea sometimes in British delivery of things like DVI. I was sat next to actually Baroness Sue Black at a conference where we were being told by other nations, and we needed to be impressed with this, that they had done things in the British way. And I think one of the things about using, before I applied it to DVI, as I say, I applied science and technology studies, a branch of medical sociology, to the way that emergency plans are imbued with huge power. We have a plan. This idea that disaster victim identification had very grandly claimed science, but actually was a huge mix of human frailties and deviation, and by claiming something was science. And and also refusing to possibly acknowledge the variations that come from just taking it from lab to lab to lab. And I've found science and technology studies, STS as it's called in sociology, incredibly illuminating for that. And in medicine, for example, that would say, why would we take a machine capable of delivering radiation from one hospital to the next and we would get difference in results? And it was because, of course, that human interaction with the machine. And basically what I love, and it's a character trait that isn't always found helpful in the environment, is the way that the science, in deliberate quotation marks, is kind of deviated from when humans apply it. And some very great and grand statements made about what was possible. And one of the things that I get very intimate with is how these statements are trumpeted in the laboratory space. And I go to 3 different labs and watch the claims that are being made about what is possible in science. And what I'm finding with my work now is I'm much more mainstream now, because, for example, people have experienced what we have all been discussing just this morning about forensic science. They've encountered with the pandemic. So Sue's very, very powerful and moving description of having to, and rightly so, bringing in uncertainty and nuance into the courtroom, but knowing that that can be very problematic for the jury. The jury likes certainty. And that was something that, I, as a government advisor in emergency planning, what ministers desperately wanted was certainty of science, the science, and saying, well, something like how you wear a normal healthcare setting mask is hugely dependent on whether the wearer plays with it around their ear or puts it tight to their face. And that was the same thing as we were saying in DNA. The accuracy of this machine will depend, and one of the examples I give is that halfway through it, a law enforcement professional rested his coffee on the machine, and inevitably, as was inevitably going to happen, it poured into the machine when somebody jolted it. There's no protocol for that. And so I think one of the things for me is that, but I think one of the reasons I fangirl forensic anthropology so much is it's one of the highly diligent physical sciences that also allows you to discuss, as Imogen says, the other things that are going on, the human interactions, the frailties, and that's been really essential to my work.
Thank you, Lucy. I'm actually going to move to you, Sue, because there's a question that's come in that follows this. You've worked in different countries, helping to identify Kosovo and places like that, to identify victims. So we're looking at that and taking on from Lucy and from what James says, that forensic anthropology as being physical and social human identification, that whole holistic view rather than just the physical bones, as been mentioned.
Yeah, and I think Lucy put it very nicely for me, in that we see it in the courtroom. And the courtroom, it's not just the courts that want certainty in terms of the legal teams. It is, of course, the jury wants it as well. And they watch television. And in television, we have all these wonderful series of forensic this, that, and the other that cures all ills. And usually we find that when we go into the courtroom, we are little else than a disappointment in many situations to the jury, because we start to talk statistics and likelihood and probability, and you can see their attention just glaze over, and they really don't want to talk about that. And so for us, it is about trying to get across, in many ways, the limits of science, what the science can do and what it can't do, and then being able to explain why it can't do what other people may think it should be able to do. And the classic thing is, almost every question you're asked in a courtroom, the answer is usually, well, it depends. It depends on a multitude of factors. And one of the most important things is that humans are not predictable to a greater or lesser extent, and they're hugely variable. So there is no single rule. Now, when you also translate that overseas into different cultures, then you create yet another tier of difficulty as you're trying to explain what you're doing and why. So if I give an example. We were in, and I'm sure you no, it was actually, I think, just before your time, Lucina, it was the year before. We were in a disused grain store in Rahovic, which is just outside Velika Kruša, down towards the southwest of Kosovo. And it was a disused grain store that we were using as a mortuary. And of course, everybody thinks because they look at the television, then, you know, there's electricity and there's running water and everything's stainless steel. You know, no, it isn't. It's the worst possible situations that you're working in. And you have to work to the highest standard that you can possibly achieve. And then I can remember a family member coming to say, we want to come into the mortuary and we want to video every single body inside the body bags. And we went, whoa, no, 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 you know, you can't do that. And then the question is, well, actually, why can't they do that? And his rationale was, people now are saying the Holocaust never existed. I don't want them to be able to say that this didn't occur in Kosovo. And then you start to think, as a scientist, what right do I have? None, to actually deny people that level of a record that brings some level of closure. So of course we did all the necessary checks legally of what we were allowed and not allowed to do. But so often when you're outside your own clinical environment, you're faced with the difficulties of social interaction. And these are people who often have an agenda. And by that, I mean, they're trying to find a loved one. They're trying to convince somebody that it isn't their loved one. It's someone who's bringing the propaganda together to be able to show politically why this is a problem in the country. It isn't easy. It's not straightforward. And you do have to have those two hats that quite clearly separate. The science says this, and this is what we can do. And then being able to find the language and the compassion and the care and dignity and decency for not only the deceased, but the living, to be able to explain it. And most of the time we found that people, if you can explain it, will accept it. And I'm going to take you back to a very dear friend of ours who is here no longer, who was a DVI commander. And Graham had said at one point when he was doing the London bombings, he had said he needed to be able to say to families, you know, we'll do the best we can, but when you have fragments and contamination, then, you know, there will be a mass of material that we simply cannot identify as being, you know, part of your son, your daughter. And excuse my language, because I'm going to use Graham's words, and those of you who ever knew Graham Walker will actually hear him saying it as I say it. And the family had said, okay, we get that. We understand, because we've watched all these forensic programs, but we know that you can get DNA from a single cell. And we will happily let you bury this material in a mass grave, as long as you can absolutely assure us there's not a single cell of the, excuse my language, murdering bastards who killed my daughter in that mass. And of course, he couldn't do that. And he had to explain why he couldn't do it. And it was a really challenging place for a policeman to have to explain the limits of the science. Sometimes it's not just the scientists that have to do it, it's those that are working with us. And so part of our job as well is to be able to work with our colleagues, to be able to give them the tools that they need to have when they're in these difficult positions of interaction. Apologies to David Shanklin, who will now be going, oh my gosh, I've now got to bleep things out on an RAI recording.
Thank you. And thank you for that. That's really interesting and really important. Rose, you yourself have worked, obviously you were talking about that juxtapositioning of social and what actually has happened in the archaeological records. Is there anything that you want to add to this sort of discussion? Because that's that social, physical, again, space.
I'm sorry, I missed the first part of your question because I'm out on the street.
Yes, no problem. I was just asking if you want to, because you looked and you were talking about an archaeological record of that you examined, and you were talking when you spoke to us earlier about that social physical space. Is there anything you wanted to add? Yes.
Right. Well, I don't even know how I'd start with that. One of the things that the ethics board really wanted to make sure is that no one was identified. And of course, we promptly potentially identified an individual because they wanted their privacy protected. In the case of documented remains, that's really helpful to have known age and sex or recorded known age and sex, and then being able to add that. The social space, I'm afraid you have to respect, people's wishes. But I do think the more that we know about an individual, the more we can then generalize it. We're all just a sample of one. So we need many, 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 many samples. People ask me, how would you feel if it was your relative? I have a relative who died. I'm very sorry that we chucked her in the ground. I think that she should have been kept for science. And especially because, SIDS is unknown. That's the acronym, isn't it? So I just think that in my case, I have a very varied view. And again, I want to be put into a box. So I will be identified. Hopefully someone will know how old I was when I died. And that's my goal. My family knows. So I don't know if that's even touching base because you're outside. But I'm probably gonna have to leave also, but I have so enjoyed this. And yes, bleep out the dirty words or whatever you feel you have to do, but I'm really looking forward to seeing this recording. I feel as I'm just simply not coherent. Sorry. Sorry, I know I probably missed that.
Thank you. No, we've got that. Thank you very much. I'm going to move on. That's really interesting. It's such a fascinating discussion and topic for discussion, because I think even working in domestically, especially somewhere like Scotland, you're so often the police that you work with are from the same community where whatever has occurred. The family are often at the cordon and waiting to hear what is happening, and that being that complete, you're in the society that you're actually working within. Spotlight's on you, but that's interaction and that crossover between the science that you're doing and the people that you are doing it for, and that you're providing answers or not providing answers or doing what you can and trying to explain your answers to. They're actually standing beside you often, and it's not just the police officers, it's actually the families as well. So absolutely, completely, all of the things that have been said completely resonates. I'm going to move on to the next question here, which is from Susan O'Brien. There's a lot of questions here, so if you have any further questions, Susan, then please, we're going to just take one part of your question, because I think there's 3 or 4 parts to it. And that's in relation to age estimation in the living, social anthropologist working in Australia. So just as asked in relation to asking how often has forensic age estimation analysis been used in legal cases in courts and other government authorities in Europe to determine the official age of unaccompanied minors. We're just going to take that part of your question for now, Valentin. And to be fair, this is there's a big answer, so this is going to be a brief answer to what's big, because all the different countries have got different experiences. But Valentina, if you don't mind answering that.
I apologize because I didn't actually introduce the topic of living age estimation during my speech. So just as a quick background, so age estimation in the living is usually carried out. So for example, when the individuals, there are some individuals that lack valid identity documents to prove their age. So there is a need to develop methodologies to actually try to estimate the biological age of the individuals, which will never be the same as the chronological age, because we actually estimate the biological age of the individuals and not the chronological age. So that's why we talk about estimation. And this can happen, as I was saying, like, for example, in my presentation, can happen like in cases of unaccompanied children, but also in cases of adoption, competitive sports, or human trafficking as well. So this was just like for a quick background on the topic that I didn't have the time to do before. So regarding how often has been used in legal cases in courts, I don't think I am the right person to answer that question, because I don't have enough experience, especially with legal cases in courts. for sure, I can say that the age estimation is usually carried out before. So like at the early stages when the individual, when the children or the individuals, come into the new country, that's when the age application, the application is submitted, and the age estimation process is carried out, and that's done to ensure that, for example, to ensure that the children, so that the applicants have an assessment of their correct status, and to also ensure that children have appropriate access to rights and resources. So I'm not sure about what happened, like if there is any case that then went to court, but I'm not, I don't think I am the right person to answer that question. So I don't know if Lucina or Sue, they have more experience in that, so they can answer that part of the question.
Thank you, Valentina. And I'm stepping in to ask Lucina the question, because Lucina is the expert on age estimation in the living.
Thank you. So thank you. To answer your question in relation to legal, Valentina is actually correct. So most age in the living is done when individuals come, or whether they're with their families or come unaccompanied over borders, and their age is questioned by the country into which they are entering. So, and it is to do completely with access to resources. If you're under the age of 18, this is a legislation that sits across universally. If you're under the age of 18, you're a child, so you're can have all of the access to education, to healthcare, to care in the community, all of the things that you are allowed as a child. Once you're past the age of 18, you're considered an adult, and therefore you're standing on your own, and the country does not have to support you as a child. So most of them aren't actually cases that go to court. Most of them are done informally, and they're done in different ways in different countries, which is why, so in the UK, we do have social workers undertaking age estimation. In other countries, it's undertaken using images and the bone changes or dental changes. Sometimes those ages, so they're assigned, they can be challenged and they may end up in court. The other time they may end up in court with an age estimation is if somebody has committed a crime, and at that point their age is questioned. And again, this is to do with people coming across borders. Maybe their papers say one thing, and the police or the court questions whether or not that's accurate, whether or not the papers have been faked. And there's another group that actually end up with age estimations happening, and those are victims of crimes. Again, they have paperwork that is questioned as to its validity, and it may well be so that they have been married underage, they have been trafficked as domestic servants and slaves, and that does happen again, not just in the UK, but in other European countries. So it's varied, and it is a very complicated picture across Europe, but across the world, actually. Australia isn't free of age estimation. They have had a number of challenges in court, which has reduced how often it happens and what happens at the border. But it is actually an ongoing issue because it's about the rights of the child to be a child and treated as a child. And for those children who are in care, not to have adults put in with them. So what you don't want to do is to take somebody that's an adult and put them in with children in school. That would be a recipe for disaster as well. But mainly it's to do with the rights of those children coming across borders, and they're not treated as adults. Hopefully that answers some of your questions. Please do feel free to contact if you've got any more questions associated with that. I'm going to move on.
Lucina, there is one, sorry. Julia has said from Oslo that there continues to be severe disagreement between medical professionals and the police and authorities regarding methods and age estimation of unaccompanied minor asylum seekers. I just wondered, as you know, in the role that you have as chair of a committee in the Home Office, whether perhaps you could give us what's the latest in the UK?
Yes, thank you. You're absolutely right. There's a lot of challenges, and I was trying to avoid the fact that there's a lot of issues around this. Thank you. So I will be thanking you for that later. But no, I think there's a number of issues. There's a number of issues in the fact that, and we say this, no age estimation, no matter what method you use, is completely accurate. I cannot say, none of us, no matter what method we use, can say that somebody is 16 years, 1 month, 2 weeks, and 3 days old. We cannot do that with a level of accuracy. What we can do, and what we're doing in the UK, is now bringing in the social age estimation methods that were being used by social workers. So they take all of the information that they can take in for the individual. They'll ask them about their memories. They'll ask them about families. They'll ask them about events that they remember, any paperwork that they can produce as well. And they will take all of that together to try and understand whether or not the age that person is claiming is likely. And what we're doing in the UK is looking to supplement that and to augment that by bringing in the physical analysis as well. So looking at the maturational changes within the body. Again, we cannot do that to the day of how old somebody is, but use that to test, is the age that the person claiming to be, how likely is that to be accurate? So if we come with an age range, does that person's claimed age fall into that age range? So we're allowing as much as we can for that uncertainty that exists in every science, and including that. But what we're trying to achieve is a holistic age estimation process that brings in the social as well as the physical at all stages, and then comes up with the likelihood ratio to try and test which to test and to decide whether the claimed age or the suspected age by the border or by the social, or whoever it is most likely. Hopefully,
and I think what your team came up with, which I thought was incredibly enlightening, was not answering the question, how old is this child? Because we can't answer it, but actually asking the more appropriate question, which is the claimed age possible? And if it's possible, then we must give the child the benefit of the doubt. And I think that's revolutionary in many ways. And, you know, that's down to the team and the team that you're leading.
Thank you. And I think we have to do it that way. I think it's the benefit of the doubt is the only way to go, because we cannot know for certain. And it's trying to feel our way between certainty and uncertainty, and to try that, bring that into the social sphere, I suppose. Thank you. I'm going to move on to the next question. So here, and I think probably James, as it actually says, social forensic anthropologist, but I think I might bring Sue and then maybe Lucy into this as well. How does the social forensic anthropologist deal with the I can't say this, I haven't had enough coffee this morning. The difference between cultural ideas in the courtroom and the external definitions and standards that are brought in. So the difference between the age of 18 as age of adult with the internal cultural standards, coming of age rituals, stage degrees of personhood, and etc. So it's just to see how we bring that together within these multiple constructions with knowledge at its core. Thank you.
Well, look, I think it's a wonderful question to really get at what brings these two branches of a single discipline together. And I think the answer to this question possibly flows very smoothly on from the previous answers that were given, which is really that sometimes the question that is put to the forensic expert is not necessarily the most informative question for the presiding authority, whether that be the police or a judge or whomever. And actually, I should say that we're just reaching the end of our first continuing professional development course under the RAI's new training framework for forensic social anthropologists. And one of the key issues that we addressed as part of that training was the role of expertise in a courtroom. We divide social anthropology up into two sets of tasks: forensic investigation and expert advice and expert opinion, right? Which is really how legal scholars divide up forensic services or expert services in a courtroom. And what expert social anthropologists do in a courtroom setting is two things. They provide either cultural translation or cultural explanation depending on what is required for the police or the judge or the tribunal delegate or whomever it happens to be that they're providing the service to, in order to facilitate a more effective and a more just decision on the part of that authority. So if you have an authority asking a question like, you know, how old is this person, or how old is this child? And we're in a position either as a physical or a biological anthropologist or a sociocultural anthropologist not to be able to answer it in the terms that they're expecting us to answer it. We help reconstruct the question for them in a way that will allow them to more effectively answer or resolve the decision that they have to make. So in a cultural setting, it might be that we have to go through the way that childhood development and transition into adulthood is contextualized in that culture in order for that judge or that police force to really understand what rights and responsibilities that individual has within their community from the perspective of other community members, and what reciprocal duties those other members of the community might have as carers or protectors for that person. And then we try to translate that understanding for the presiding authority in a way that allows them to bring in to their purview the idea systems or the cultural models of that community of people to be able to deliver a more effective outcome. And a very concrete example, very quickly, if I may, is that of traditional punishment in Central Australia. So in Central Australia, the majority of Indigenous Australians who live there speak English as a second language. Their religion is still very much in force, and they deal with a lot of the breaches of justice that they experience in their communities via their own means. So we have this sort of system of legal pluralism in Australia, in which Indigenous law is recognised to an extent, either semi-formally or entirely formally, by either the police or the judicial system operating in those more remote regions. Now, in some instances, there have been what we would call payback or punitive punishment for serious breaches of traditional law. And those usually have to do with things like physical assault or murder, where in order to maintain peace in the community, it is decided by community leaders, usually very senior and highly respected people, that there should be some limited form of physical retribution carefully executed or carefully imposed upon a perpetrator after consideration within the community. And depending on how carefully considered that decision has been and how restrained the punishment is in terms of not causing any catastrophic injury to the perpetrator, the police will tolerate it, right? So that's an example of legal pluralism in effect. But if there is tension between the view of the police and the view of the community leadership with respect to that punishment, and a social anthropologist were to be brought in, then their role would be to translate the rights and responsibilities of the individuals within the community with respect to their autochthonous models of culture, in order that the police and the judge may better comprehend whether it was reasonable and proportionate and so forth. That's one example. Social anthropologists in Australia do work like that all the time in lots of different situations.
Thank you. That's really fascinating. Sue, obviously you go into the courtroom and talk about these different ideas, and we're dealing with situations of bereavement and situations where events have occurred. So have you ever had any experience of this sort of tension between these different cultural ideas and the actual idea of science coming in and changing things?
It's a really big question in some ways, and I'll try and break it down into some parts. Much of the time, cultural elements are not within our remit. And the reason I say that is there's an expectation in the UK courts that if you are brought in as an expert witness, you are an expert in usually a particular area. So if there were cultural questions, then it would be out with my area of expertise. And so you tend not to get asked them, which is good in some ways. And the thing that's difficult in the courtroom is that you can only answer the questions that you're asked. And that's really hard because sometimes there are things that you want to say and you don't have the permission to say them unless you're asked the right question. And that's often quite challenging as well, because you've got something else to offer, but you're not free to give it unless the door is open for you to do that. And sometimes you can preempt that in the cross-examination or re-examination process. If your lawyer is sufficiently tuned in to what you're trying to say to them, often they aren't, because they got the case that morning and so they're not terribly prepared for either. So we have a legal system in the UK that is really groaning at the edges. And often we find that once we get into court, the person who is the legal team on there doesn't have any more experience of that case than you do. They're reading it from the notes in front of them. So that can be very, very challenging. Where it is difficult, and only one case that I can think of that was particularly difficult, was a murder and a dismemberment. And the father had asked if he could meet every member of the team who had ever handled his daughter's remains. And the pathologist said no. The pathologist refused to meet the father. And I thought I could do the same, but I can't. So of course I'll meet him. You know, when I think that somebody wants to take that incredible step across the Rubicon to be able to talk to someone who's handled their daughter's remains, then the least that I can do is be there. But it was the most difficult situation I've ever found myself in. What do you say to a man who is thanking you for what you've done, when what you've done is analyze the dismembered remains of his daughter, who was murdered at the hands of his son? And, you know, it was culturally, socially, psychologically, emotionally really difficult. It wasn't in the courtroom, it was outside the courtroom. And it's not a place that we normally find ourselves in, because normally we can create a nice little clinical box around what we do if we're operating in the UK. And that's where I think, to be honest, most of us are more comfortable. It's where I have enormous and unbounded respect for the works that James does, for the work that Lucy does. They go out there and they do literally integrate with the problem. I'm glad in many ways that I don't have to. It makes me a coward.
Thank you very much. And that's a great example where it crosses over. Lucy, I'm going to bring you in here. So do you have
yeah, I mean, you know me, there's just so many examples, and I think this is where forensic anthropology as an external looking in is the safest place for me to find this home to problematize the clashes. You raised it beautifully in your discussion about trying to find a complex pragmatism to mold two sort of opposite spectrum words. You do it in your work. One of the things, it is a bit of a Lucina fan club today. One of the things I love working with you too. Eventually Lucina is to write a book called I'm the Lucina. Because both Sue and I couldn't do it without
the number of people who said to me, where do I find Lucina? How do I get a Lucina?
Yeah, you can't
and I say, hands off, she's mine.
No. And then one of the things I love working about with you is your way, you literally through kind of mud and ash to find a pragmatism. And I very heavily kind of weight on you this ability to find a way through between the science and the human need to find a pragmatism. You know, I described in a lot of my writing, it's in the article, but also in some of my other writing, about how I look to you to triage a fire scene. What would you give advice on? And Sue picked something up that I didn't say in my own summary, which is hugely important to me, that fits with this answer as well, which is about dancing this dance between grieving families, and in fact at the very first stage that you're meeting them, families who are not yet grieving, families who are hoping that they are not caught up, And as Sue perfectly captured Graham's thoughts, one of the things that Lucina, Sue, and sometimes myself is brought in to do is to provide a strategy answer for a very, very under pressure senior identification manager who has about 40 minutes before they are in a cabinet office meeting with the Prime Minister to say that they have everything under control, and the Daily Mail front page is already that they are taking too long. So one of the difficulties, I think, for walking that path is which voices do you hear, which cultural practices do you keep, all of these things. And is there many disciplines, I've brought my article up, that allows you to end an article that says Western societal efforts to prioritize DNA using technology that appears closely guarded and remains expensive has left practitioners open to accusations of colonialism, prejudice, and inequality, creating hierarchies of priority in major incidents and allowing resources to dictate answers such as a fundamental human right. This article has demonstrated that there are many considerations that come with the deployment of these technologies, and particularly those involving DNA analysis, ethical and legal considerations, as well as societal and moral soul searching. They pose as many questions as they answer, is my last line. And again, that's why I'm so grateful to both forensic anthropology as a field and anthropology as a field for allowing me to problematize. And the one time I remember just being so grateful that I had you guys to chew these things over with was at an event in The Hague where DNA technology was being used repeatedly in mass grave and conflict situations for the first time in Iraq and Afghanistan. And there was a huge pressure on Western societies to donate this technology. And a scientist was lobbying against it. It was an open kind of forum discussion. And he said, you know, sometimes there is a culture of where if the woman couldn't get pregnant, it may not be, and we know this from a lot of our DVI and DNA work, that sometimes the father is not the father. And by coming up with a very, very pure scientific analysis of the situation, you were endangering the mother by providing a result that both confirmed her maternity, but also made it very obvious that the father was not the father. And so the scientist who was giving that example was asked what he'd done, and he said, I shredded the results. And so the question for me was, should the technology have ever been deployed? Shouldn't we ask the question before the machines were sent? And that was the heart of what I'm so grateful when I'm ushered into these debates to be allowed to do, and the esteem that forensic anthropology is held in. And also Sue's point about the vein analysis being so much more than, you know, people saying that's not pure forensic anthropology, it doesn't involve bones. I think this special edition is an example of, let's widen that debate, let's have all the debates if we can. But in my work, both in this article and in my book When the Dust Settles, it's all about this clash between, and it is a clash, it's not gentle, it's not easy, between human needs, cultural needs, spiritual needs, to lay your hands on the bones, all of these kind of things.
I think there's some really lovely points within there, Lucy. And I can remember a particular case that we did many years ago when we had an unidentified body, and we gave the strategy to the police that said, you know, you go down, you speak to mum, you speak to dad separately, you take the DNA samples. If mum says she's the biological mother, you only need to run one set of DNA. If you run the other set of DNA, you have to disclose it. If you don't need to run it, don't run it. Why would you want to open up much more grief in that family than they already have? And that was a strategy that I know that force followed for quite some time. And it is that humanitarian side that understands, you know, there are some things that you just don't need additional knowledge of when you're going through a grief like that.
Thank you. And I think apologies, that's some trouble doing this at home. Just a quick question, just James, bringing that in, and you've both, all of you've brought that up, and it's really interesting. James, obviously you're going to be training forensic social anthropologists now. How are you going to train that bringing that together, that social and changes along with the the sort of how you feed this back into the system so that the changes happen going forwards, I think, is a question.
Yeah, no, wonderful. Thank you, Lucina. I was hoping that we'd get a chance to promote the RAI's latest world-changing initiative. We are, with the support, of course, and originally of Sue, and of course with yourself and with David, we have developed and been developing since 2021 a new certification framework and accompanying regulatory framework, all of which is adapted from the very well thought through and carefully implemented forensic physical anthropological continuing professional development and certification framework. What we're looking to do in the first instance is to avail our colleagues in social anthropology of a common set of theoretical, methodological, and ethical principles that will help crystallize the work that they are already doing in different parts of the world under different jurisdictions with different presiding authorities, whether they be courts or statutory authorities or NGOs or whichever, but which involve, in the first instance, which I alluded to earlier, forensic investigation into the cultural foundations of certain kinds of social behaviour that are of interest to courts and other presiding authorities, such that social or cultural anthropologists are considered to be relevant by presiding authorities. They're called as expert witnesses. So many of us already do that. Hundreds, in fact, of us do that. Secondly, methodologically, we all use a core set of modelling and analysis techniques, many of which go to something that's been mentioned a few times this evening, which is kinship modelling. So a lot of the time, what presiding authorities who are interested in social culture want to know about is the kinship structure surrounding a child or a victim or a perpetrator or a community that have fallen prey to a war crime or an act of genocide. And it's not just kinship, it is, of course, certain kinds of religious practice and economic practice. And finally, ethically, what we all know as social anthropologists, and this goes a little bit to the question that was asked, I think, by Imogen earlier, is that there is a strong sense of wanting to do the right thing, which is often, unfortunately, considered to be unique to the humanities, but which is, of course, universal among all people, even the scientists. We all want to do the right thing by other people. The question is, how do we formalize this urge using a set of terms and definitions that is acceptable to everyone? And what we've found, and I just completed a 12-month study funded by the School of Population and Global Health here at the University of Melbourne, is that we all have concern to minimize risk of harm to the people with whom we work. And this might not be acutely relevant to forensic physical anthropologists because, unfortunately, the harm has reached its most ultimate effect, which is to take the life of a person away or people away. But in the case of social anthropologists, we tend to be working with living people. And what we want to do is to prevent not only any further harm coming to them because of cultural inequality, but to not ourselves wind up contributing to any further harm. And so the first port of call is to then look at those ethics frameworks that exist among learned societies of social anthropologists around the world, take from those the elements which most clearly articulate this desire to do no harm or to minimize any further harm, and to then adapt it in such a way that it could be acceptable to courts. Because what we cannot be as experts is advocates. Otherwise, our evidence is inadmissible, you see. And this is the perennial challenge for social anthropologists all over the world, because we love to be activists, but unfortunately in the courtroom, we're not allowed to be. So the question is, how do we fulfill that urge to give the greatest regard for the well-being of the people with whom we work while avoiding the categorization of advocacy, the allegation of advocacy? And we do this by saying very clearly the evidence that we're presenting in this forum is taking into account the risks and vulnerabilities of the people with whom we work, which is often disproportionate precisely because they are culturally marginalized already. And that is our expertise, to say that there is nothing that prejudices us as potential advocates in drawing the judge's attention to that. So yes, as part of that course, that it's the theoretical, the methodological, and the ethical foci that we all have in common already, and putting aside the things we might argue about in a more sort of, arcane way, and agreeing on those ideals, and then helping to build a new global practice around those things that we have in common, which are of course shared by all scientists, even the physical anthropologists. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm aware of time, and thank you all for your questions. We have David here. I wonder, David, if you wanted to say a few words just as we finish. I'm going to finish by saying thank you to everybody that's presented today and spoken today, and to everybody here that has asked questions. I think you'll agree with me that that was a fascinating discussion, and the ideas and the thoughts and the experiences that have come out from this are things that you can take, well, certainly I take forwards and continue to think about every single day that I work. So thank you all for giving your time and for writing your papers, but actually being here today to discuss them. Thank you. David, I'm going to pass over to yourself.
Well, thank you very much. I'm sorry for being a bit late, but I caught, I think, all of them except the beginning of James's paper, which I was very sorry to miss. But I too have enjoyed working with the forensic anthropology community enormously, and I think that's the first thing to say is really what an exceptional event this is. I mean, to have a full forensic anthropology supplement reflected in the JRAI marks, I think, both the end point of an initiative which we've been working on together for almost the last decade, and of course the beginning point of a new synthesis between the respective branches of the areas of interest of the fellows of the RAI, and a huge step forward in the practical way that we can actually help show how anthropology in all its forms is relevant to the public life of the country and internationally. So it really is a triumph. I've read the papers also with very, very great interest, and I'd like to congratulate the authors of them. Now, just as has been foreshadowed, we are going to be expanding our program in forensic anthropology in two ways. We are going to be running courses in forensic anthropology. James, who's with us, has already started with 3 of them, and it's not too late to book for his second and his third courses if you're interested in his area. But I should also say, thanks to the University of Dundee and Dr. Davis there, we will be running courses in, I suppose, what you might want to call physical forensic anthropology, if that's the right term, or certainly in what more conventionally is understood as forensic anthropology. And the first one is going to be opening up soon. So again, it's going to be possible to learn about the possibilities of forensic anthropology through a series of courses for our fellows and anyone else who's interested. But not only that, the certification program that's occasionally been referred to is also being expanded to include forensic social anthropology and expert forensic social anthropology, as well as the conventional one that we have in ordinary forensic anthropology. We're going to have to get used to working out the best way to express this. Anyway, the point is that it means that a fellow of the RAI will be able to get a chartered qualification in forensic anthropology treated extremely broadly, from the point of view of being a cultural expert in a subject, from being a social anthropologist interested in how to defend, for example, land claims, right up into recognition of facial features in deceased bodies. So we really, really hope that this will provide a really robust way to encourage people to realize that they can interact with the court system in ways that they may find appropriate and the courts find appropriate, and also that we can provide the relevant training and feedback and robust examination process, which means that this qualification will be trusted not only in Britain but also internationally. Now, just in the last couple of minutes, I'd just like to make one comment about the question about the teaching of social anthropology that was raised earlier, which I think is quite rightly absolutely fundamental. I think there are 2 points there. The first one is, it goes without saying that all science is socially constructed. It shouldn't even need to be said. And I think that has been turned into, as it were, a new discovery is an absolute catastrophe from the point of view of the pedagogy of teaching social anthropology, again, both here and abroad. You see, if there are no human beings, there is no science. There is no science on the moon. There is no science on Mars. There is no science in pure empty space. So it means, of course, that human beings invented it. That isn't the point. The point is what kind of cognitive frameworks we are putting in place leads to better or to worse understandings of the external world. That's the absolute point. And a certain framework, that is, call it what you like, Western science, it doesn't matter what you call it, has in fact shown to be fantastically effective at our understanding of external reality. It simply works. It's much, much, much better, cognitively speaking, much more powerful cognitively speaking than almost in any other way of looking at the external world. It doesn't mean to say that there are all sorts of valid comments that someone might make or valid understandings, but the point is that one absolutely works tremendously. But that also doesn't mean to say for a moment that what is being claimed when people say that they're doing science is that they're telling the truth. That's not the case at all. The point is that science is changing every day. Science is changing far more quickly than traditional indigenous cognitive structures do, far more. The science that was obsolete, the science that's valid this week will be obsolete next week. And that doesn't happen at all in endlessly perpetuating cognitive structures. So when whoever it was, and I don't know if there was any one individual, whenever this sentiment took over that tried to paint science as being claiming that they were telling the truth, as something that was rigid against the flexibility of humanitarian understanding, basically it was fine as a piece of propaganda, but it was the exact opposite of the case as what's actually happening. In fact, science as a humanitarian side, from the point of view of being endlessly flexible, endlessly innovative, endlessly moving, deeply related to the various individuals who are doing it, against cognitive structures which actually perpetuate themselves remarkably over many hundreds of years sometimes and don't actually change that much. So if we are going to talk about rigidity, it's the indigenous structures that are more rigid, including our own, of course. I'm not for a moment talking about this in any geographically specific way. And the point is, which is more effective, as I say. And you can only understand that if you actually work out what is appropriate evidence that we can use in any of our researches and also for the court case as well. But once one does realize that, it shows just how very, very false and misleading that inappropriate set of pairings has been for the development of our discipline for at least the last 50 or 60 years. And the sooner we get over that, the sooner that we can talk to each other much, much more easily, and the sooner that we can all work much more effectively as a collective discipline going forward. There we are. I can see there's only 1 more minute left until we close. And so it just remains me to thank my colleagues so much for their remarkably, endlessly stimulating interaction and turn over back to the chair to close the session. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody. And thank you all for joining us from wherever in the world you have joined us. Thank you, James, for staying up this evening as well. And I see from your introductions that we have people internationally as well as in the UK. So thank you. And that's it. Thank you all and goodbye. Thank you.